It's funny how life has a way of throwing curveballs when you're already down. A few years ago, I found myself in a situation so bleak it felt like the universe had personally singled me out for punishment. I had just graduated from college, supposedly the golden ticket to success, but instead of landing my dream job, I was stuck working at a dead-end position that barely paid enough to cover my groceries. To make matters worse, my boss seemed to have it out for me. He'd nitpick every little thing I did, blaming me for mistakes I didn't even commit. One day, he threatened to fire me over an error in a report that he himself had approved earlier. It was absurd, infuriating, and utterly demoralizing. The stress was suffocating. I could feel my self-worth crumbling with each passing day. With rent prices skyrocketing and no financial safety net, I knew I couldn't survive on my own. That's when my older brother Tom stepped in, or so I thought. He offered me a place to stay with him and his wife, Corinne, in their modest but comfortable home. At first, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. Every move I made seemed to set off invisible alarms in her head. If I walked into the kitchen while she was cooking, she'd stiffen up as though I might sabotage her meal. If I lingered too long in the living room, she'd shoot me these dagger-like glares that screamed, "What are you still doing here?" At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was stressed about work or something else going on in her life. Maybe she was just naturally reserved, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that her hostility ran deeper than mere discomfort. There was something calculated about the way she treated me, as if she saw me not as family, but as an intruder invading her perfect little world. And the worst part, Tom either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. He kept reassuring me that everything was fine, that Corinne was just adjusting to sharing space again, but I wasn't convinced. Something about her behavior felt deliberate, almost predatory, like she was biding her time before making her next move. Looking back now, I realized that those early days were warning signs, red flags waving furiously in my face, but I was too desperate to see them clearly. All I cared about was surviving, keeping my head above water long enough to find solid ground. Little did I know, the storm was only beginning to brew. At first, I thought living with Tom and Corinne would be a temporary but manageable solution, a way to get back on my feet after the chaos of post-college life. But what started as an act of kindness from my brother quickly turned into something far more complicated, and frankly, suffocating. The cracks in our fragile coexistence began to show sooner than I expected, and it all escalated one evening while I was cooking dinner. I had just finished chopping vegetables when Corinne walked into the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest like she was preparing for battle. Her lips were pursed, and her eyes darted around the room as though searching for evidence of some invisible crime. "You know," she said sharply, breaking the silence, "you've been using up way too much food lately. Do you have any idea how expensive groceries are these days?" I froze mid-stir, the wooden spoon still clutched in my hand. My mind raced to recall every meal I'd prepared since moving in. Sure, I cooked often, but only because I wanted to contribute. Tom and Corinne both worked long hours, and I figured making dinner was the least I could do. And yet here she was, accusing me of being some kind of freeloader who drained their resources without giving anything back. I don't think I've used that much," I stammered, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the growing knot in my stomach. "If anything, I've been buying extra stuff whenever I can afford it," Corinne scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Oh please, you really expect me to believe that? Every time I open the fridge, half the things are gone. It's not sustainable, especially now that we're planning for the baby." She emphasized the word baby as if it somehow justified her accusations, as if the mere mention of her pregnancy gave her permission to treat me however she pleased. The accusation felt like a slap across the face, not because of the words themselves, but because of the sheer unfairness of it all. Here I was, doing everything I could to pull my weight, and instead of gratitude, I got suspicion and hostility. I tried to explain myself again, but Corinne cut me off before I could finish. "Look, I'm just saying this needs to stop. We can't afford to support someone else right now." That night marked the beginning of a toxic shift in our household dynamic. What should have been a simple misunderstanding spiraled into something darker, more insidious. Over the next few weeks, Karen became increasingly distant, her demeanor icy and unwelcoming. She avoided eye contact during meals and barely acknowledged my presence unless it was to drop another passive-aggressive comment about how tight things were financially or how small the house suddenly felt. But the worst part came later, when I discovered the extent of her manipulation. One afternoon, while grabbing a glass of water in the kitchen, I accidentally overheard Karen talking on the phone with one of her friends. At first, I didn't pay much attention until her voice grew louder, laced with frustration and disdain. "Honestly, he's such a burden," she said, her tone dripping with venom. "He acts like he belongs here, like he's doing us some huge favor by staying. But really, he's just taking advantage of us." My blood ran cold. I stood frozen in place, gripping the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles turned white. Was this really how she saw me, a parasite feeding off their generosity? Her words cut deeper than any insult I'd ever received, not because they were true they weren't, but because they came from someone who was supposed to be family. As the days went on, I noticed subtle changes in Tom's behavior too. He wasn't outright hostile like Karen, but there was a hesitation in his interactions with me, a lingering doubt that hadn't been there before. I couldn't help but wonder if Karen had been planting seeds of distrust in his mind, poisoning him against me little by little. It was a slow, calculated process, one designed to isolate me and make me feel like an outsider in a home where I once felt safe. Each passing day brought new challenges. Karen found reasons to criticize nearly everything I did, no matter how trivial. If I left a towel on the bathroom floor, she'd sigh loudly and mutter under her breath about messy habits. If I stayed up late watching TV, she'd complain about the noise disturbing her sleep. Even my attempts to help out around the house, cleaning, running errands, or fixing things, were met with thinly veiled resentment, as though she resented my very existence. It was exhausting, navigating this minefield of tension and mistrust. Every action felt like a potential trigger for another confrontation, another accusation. I started second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if I truly was imposing on them or if Karen's paranoia was clouding her judgment. Deep down, though, I knew the truth. This wasn't about me at all. This was about control, Karen's need to assert dominance over a situation she perceived as threatening. And yet, despite the mounting pressure, I refused to give up. I reminded myself daily why I was there: to rebuild my life, to prove that I could stand on my own 2 feet. But even the strongest resolve has its limits, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing beneath the surface. Little did I know, Karen's campaign against me was only just beginning. As the weeks turned into months, Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic, and her actions began to feel less like passive-aggressive jabs and more like calculated attacks. It was as if her pregnancy had unlocked a side of her I'd never seen before, a side that was paranoid, controlling, and utterly relentless. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just stressed about becoming a mother or overwhelmed by the changes in her life. But deep down, I knew something darker was at play. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my room only to find my bed soaked with water. The mattress, the sheets, even the pillow all drenched. My heart sank as I stared at the mess, trying to figure out how this could have happened. Before I could process what I was seeing, Karen appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression smug yet accusatory. "Oh, I see you've been spilling things again," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really need to be more careful. This isn't a hotel, you know." "What are you talking about?" I asked, bewildered. "I didn't spill anything." "How did this even happen?" She shrugged nonchalantly, as though my confusion amused her. "Well, maybe you should think about cleaning up after yourself better. Tom and I aren't your housekeepers." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing there, stunned and furious. It wasn't until later that night, when I replayed the scene in my head, that the truth hit me like a freight train. She had done it on purpose. She must have poured water onto my bed while I was out, then framed me for being careless. The realization made my blood boil. Not only had she gone out of her way to sabotage me, but she also manipulated the situation to make me look irresponsible. And worst of all, Tom believed her. When I confronted him about it, he sighed and muttered something about how I needed to be more considerate and help keep the house tidy. His words stung because they weren't just dismissive, they were complicit. But the water incident was only the beginning. A few days later, I noticed small cameras strategically placed around the house. They were discreet, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for them. One was perched on the bookshelf in the living room, another hidden among the plants near the kitchen window. When I asked Corinne about them, she acted as though it was no big deal. "Oh, we're just taking precautions," she said breezily. "With everything going on in the neighborhood lately, we thought it would be smart to install some security cameras." "Security cameras?" I echoed, incredulous. "Inside the house? That's excessive, don't you think?" Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "Better safe than sorry, right? Besides, it's not like we're spying on anyone. We just want to make sure everyone feels secure." The way she emphasized everyone sent a chill down my spine. It was clear who these cameras were really meant for me. Every move I made felt scrutinized, every action dissected under a microscope. If I lingered too long in one spot, I imagined her rewinding footage to analyze my behavior. If I accidentally knocked over a glass or left a towel on the bathroom floor, I braced myself for another lecture about how I was messing up their home. Living under constant surveillance took a toll on my mental health. I started second-guessing myself constantly, wondering if Corinne was watching me even when I couldn't see the cameras. Was she recording my conversations, monitoring my comings and goings? The paranoia gnawed at me, making it hard to relax even in what was supposed to be my own space. It felt like I was living in a prison disguised as a family home, with Corinne as the warden calling all the shots. And yet, despite the mounting evidence of her hostility, Tom remained oblivious or perhaps willfully ignorant. Whenever I tried to explain how suffocating Corinne's behavior had become, he brushed it off as her being overprotective due to the pregnancy. "She's just worried about the baby," he'd say, as though that excused everything. But I knew better. This wasn't about protecting her unborn child, it was about control. Corinne wanted me gone, and she was willing to use any means necessary to make that happen, even if it meant turning our once peaceful household into a battleground. The tension in the house had been simmering for weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that fateful evening. It was supposed to be a quiet night, just another mundane moment in a home that had become increasingly suffocating. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, trying to distract myself from the growing unease in my chest. Corinne had been unusually quiet all day, which should have been a red flag, but I didn't think much of it at the time. She often retreated into herself when she was plotting something, though I hadn't fully grasped the extent of her schemes until now. As I passed by her chair to grab a glass of water from the kitchen, she suddenly let out an ear-piercing scream that made my blood run cold. "What are you doing?" she shrieked, clutching her shoulder as if I'd just assaulted her. "You touched me? How dare you touch me like that?" I froze mid-step, my mind racing to process what she was accusing me of. Touch her? I hadn't even brushed against her. I was simply walking past, minding my own business. But before I could utter a single word in defense, Tom burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. He must have heard Corinne scream from upstairs because he stormed down with such intensity that the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. "What the hell is going on here?" Tom demanded, his voice booming like thunder. His eyes darted between Corinne and me, but there was no neutrality in his gaze. He already knew who he believed. "I didn't do anything," I stammered, holding up my hands in surrender. "I swear, I didn't touch her. I was just walking by." But Corinne wasn't having any of it. With tears streaming down her face, she pointed a trembling finger at me. He grabbed my shoulder. "Tom, right there, out of nowhere. You saw how close he was standing to me. What else could it mean?" Tom's jaw clenched, and without hesitation, he slammed his fist onto the coffee table so hard that the sound echoed through the entire house. "Explain yourself," he barked, glaring at me with a mixture of fury and betrayal. The look in his eyes cut deeper than any accusation Karen could hurl. It was clear he'd already made up his mind. "I can't explain something that didn't happen," I shot back, my voice rising despite my attempts to stay calm. "Karen's lying. Why would I ever touch her? She's your wife, for God's sake." For a brief second, I thought I saw doubt flicker across Tom's face, but it vanished almost instantly when Karen collapsed onto the floor, feigning unconsciousness. Her body went limp, and her head lolled to the side as if she'd fainted dead away. "Oh my God, Karen!" Tom shouted, panic overtaking him as he rushed to her side. He cradled her in his arms, frantically calling her name while shooting daggers at me over his shoulder. "She's fine," I insisted, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "She's faking this whole thing." But Tom wasn't listening. In his eyes, I was the villain, the perpetrator of some unforgivable crime. Without another word, he scooped Karen into his arms and carried her out to the car, muttering under his breath about taking her to the hospital. As they sped off into the night, I stood alone in the living room, my heart pounding and my fists clenched in frustration. The absurdity of the situation hit me like a freight train. How had things escalated so quickly, and why did Tom trust her so blindly? That night marked a turning point, a point of no return. When they returned hours later, Tom barely acknowledged my presence. Instead, he avoided eye contact, retreating to their bedroom and shutting the door behind him. Karen, on the other hand, wore a smug expression that told me everything I needed to know. She had won this round, manipulating both Tom and the situation with chilling precision. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Every glance, every whispered conversation felt loaded with suspicion and hostility. I realized then that Karen wasn't just pushing me out. She was dismantling my relationship with Tom brick by brick. And worst of all, Tom allowed it to happen, letting his loyalty to his wife blind him to the truth. Being kicked out of Tom and Karen's house wasn't just a betrayal, it was the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. The moment they handed me that envelope with money for rent, I knew our relationship had been irrevocably shattered. But what came next hit harder than anything else. Tom declared that my old car, the one I'd been painstakingly paying off in installments, was now compensation for the time I'd stayed under their roof. My stomach churned as he said it so casually, like he was doing me some kind of favor. "You've been living here rent-free," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "The least you can do is leave the car behind." "It's only fair." "Fair," I echoed, incredulous. "That car isn't even fully paid off. How is this fair?" But arguing was pointless. Tom had already made up his mind, and Karen stood silently in the corner, arms crossed, wearing a smug expression that told me she'd planned this all along. Without another word, I grabbed my bags and walked out, leaving behind not just the car but also any lingering hope that my brother might still care about me. With nowhere to go, I started crashing on friends' couches. At first, people were sympathetic. They offered spare blankets, let me use their showers, and even shared meals with me. But hospitality has its limits, especially when you're constantly reminded that you're imposing. Every night spent sleeping on someone else's furniture felt like a ticking clock counting down until they got tired of having me around. I tried to keep a low profile, helping out wherever I could, washing dishes, running errands, or tidying up, but no matter how hard I worked, there was always this unspoken tension hanging over me. One stormy night, the situation reached a breaking point. I was staying at Jake's place, a friend from college who'd always been supportive, and exhaustion finally caught up with me. After a long day of work, I collapsed onto his sofa, hoping to get some rest before heading out again early the next morning. The rain pounded against the windows, thunder shaking the walls as lightning illuminated the room in flashes. Somewhere between drifting off and full-on sleep, I heard shouting outside. A group of rowdy neighbors had gathered near the building, their voices loud enough to wake the dead. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock at the door. Jake answered, and within seconds, two police officers barged in, their flashlights scanning the dimly lit living room. Before I could process what was happening, one of them pointed directly at me. "Is this him?" he asked Jake, his tone accusatory. "What? Him for what?" Jake replied, clearly confused. "This guy caused a disturbance earlier tonight," the officer explained, glaring at me. Several residents reported seeing him arguing loudly outside. My heart sank. "I haven't left the apartment all evening," I protested, sitting upright on the couch. "You can ask Jake, I've been here the whole time." Jake immediately backed me up, explaining that I'd arrived home hours ago and hadn't stepped foot outside since. Still, the officers weren't convinced. They demanded ID, questioned me aggressively, and even threatened to take me downtown if I couldn't provide proof of my whereabouts. Panic surged through me as I realized how precarious my position was. With no fixed address and nothing tying me to stability, I looked every bit the suspicious character they assumed I was. It took nearly an hour of heated back and forth before Jake managed to convince them I was innocent. He called another mutual friend who corroborated my alibi, and eventually, the cops reluctantly left, muttering something about keeping the noise down. As soon as the door closed behind them, I slumped back onto the couch, trembling not just from fear but from sheer frustration. For the first time in my life, I felt utterly powerless, like the world itself had turned against me. Jake sat down beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Hey man, don't let this get to you. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," I replied, though my voice cracked under the weight of everything I'd endured. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm living on borrowed time. What happens when the next person decides they've had enough of me? Where will I go then?" Jake didn't have an answer, and neither did I. That night marked a turning point, a realization that relying on others wouldn't sustain me forever. If I wanted to survive, I needed to claw my way out of this mess on my own terms. No more depending on family, no more leaning on friends. From that moment forward, I resolved to rebuild my life brick by brick, even if it meant starting from scratch. Life after being kicked out of Tom and Corinne's house was a relentless grind, but what I didn't expect was the extent to which Corinne would go to make sure I stayed away. It wasn't just about forcing me out of their lives. She wanted to ensure I couldn't even think about coming back. One evening, as I walked home from my second job, I noticed a group of shadowy figures lingering near the alleyway leading to my apartment building. At first, I thought they were just loiterous people passing time in the dimly lit streets, but something about them felt off. They weren't talking or laughing like most groups do. Instead, they stood silently, watching. As I approached, one of them stepped forward, blocking my path. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through me. "You're the guy who used to live with Corinne, right?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. The question caught me off guard. How did these strangers know about Corinne? Before I could respond, another man chimed in, his tone dripping with hostility. "She sent us. Said you've been causing trouble." "Trouble?" I echoed, incredulous. "I haven't done anything. What are you talking about?" The leader smirked, stepping closer until he was inches from my face. "Don't play dumb. Corinne says you're thinking about showing up at her place again. She doesn't want that. So here's the deal, you leave them alone, or we'll make sure things get uncomfortable for you." My stomach churned as realization hit me like a freight train. Corinne had hired them to intimidate me, to scare me into staying far away. The audacity of it left me speechless. Even after everything she'd done, she still saw me as a threat, someone who needed to be controlled. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure despite the rising panic. "Tell Corinne I'm not interested in her games," I said firmly, though my voice wavered slightly. "And if she sends you again, I'll call the police." Their laughter echoed in the narrow alleyway, mocking my attempt at defiance. "Go ahead," the leader sneered. "See how much good that does you." With that, they turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, trembling with anger and fear. That night, I barely slept, every creak and rustle outside my window sending shivers down my spine. It was clear, Corinne wasn't going to let me move on quietly, but the harassment didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing subtle signs that I was being followed. Random cars parked outside my workplace, unfamiliar faces showing up wherever I went. It was as if Corinne had woven an invisible web around me, tightening its grip with each passing day. The constant paranoia weighed heavily on my mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. Yet, I refused to give in. If Corinne thought she could break me, she was wrong. To make ends meet, I took on 2 jobs, one during the day at a retail store and another at night as a janitor. The hours were grueling, and the exhaustion gnawed at me relentlessly. Some days, I barely had time to eat, surviving on coffee and whatever scraps I could grab between shifts. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, and my body began to protest against the relentless strain. One particularly brutal afternoon, while mopping floors at the retail store, I suddenly felt lightheaded. The world spun around me, colors blurring together until everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold tile floor, surrounded by concerned coworkers. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, helping me sit up. I nodded weakly, though my head throbbed and my vision remained hazy. The manager suggested I take the rest of the day off, but I knew I couldn't afford to lose the hours. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand, ignoring the dizziness and nausea that threatened to pull me under again. That incident should have been a wake-up call, but I ignored it. Pride or perhaps stubbornness kept me pushing forward. Every dollar I earned felt like a small victory, a step closer to reclaiming control over my life. I told myself I didn't need anyone, not Tom, not Corinne, not even friends who might offer help. Relying on others had only led to disappointment before, and I wasn't about to let history repeat itself. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Late nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right choices. Days when the fatigue was so overwhelming that simply getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. But through it all, I held on to one truth: I was building something for myself, brick by painstaking brick. No matter how hard Corinne tried to drag me down, I refused to let her win. It's strange how life has a way of turning the tables when you least expect it. For Tom and Corinne, the couple who had once so callously pushed me out of their lives, fate dealt them a cruel hand that left them reeling. Their business adventure they had poured every ounce of savings into collapsed overnight, leaving them buried under an avalanche of debt. The house they proudly owned was foreclosed, forcing them to sell off everything of value just to stay afloat. Even Corinne's wedding ring, a symbol of their union and promises made, ended up on the pawnshop counter as they scrambled to cover mounting bills. The weight of their failure wasn't just financial. It seeped into every corner of their existence. They moved from one cramped apartment to another, each place more dilapidated than the last. Their pride, once unshakable, crumbled with each passing day. But nothing hit harder than the night their youngest son fell ill. It started innocuously enough, a slight cough here, a mild complaint about feeling cold there, but by midnight, his fever had spiked dangerously high. His tiny body burned like fire, and his labored breathing sent waves of panic through Corinne, whose face turned pale with terror. "We need to take him to the hospital," she whispered hoarsely, clutching the boy tightly against her chest. Her voice cracked under the strain of desperation, but reality loomed large before them. They didn't have the money for medical care. Every penny they scraped together went toward food and rent, leaving no room for emergencies. As the minutes ticked by, the child's condition worsened, his small frame racked with shivers despite the blankets piled atop him. Tom paced the room, his hands trembling as he clutched his phone. He called everyone he could think of, friends, distant relatives, even former colleagues, but all lines led to dead ends. No one could help. Finally, after what felt like hours of agonizing indecision, he dialed my number. I hadn't heard from him in months, not since our last conversation where I'd firmly told him I wouldn't let them move in with me. Yet now, hearing his voice on the other end of the line, I realized how broken he sounded. Please pick up," he muttered, his tone laced with raw emotion. When I answered, his words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "I don't know who else to call. Our son, he's sick, really sick. We can't afford the hospital, and we're scared. Please, we need your help." His voice broke on the final plea, and for a moment, I thought I heard him sob. The sound jarred me, not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because it brought back memories of my own darkest days. Days when I too had been desperate, abandoned, and without a lifeline. My grip tightened around the phone as conflicting emotions surged within me. Part of me wanted to hang up, to let karma run its course, and force them to face the consequences of their actions. After all, hadn't they done the same to me? But then I pictured the little boy, innocent and helpless, caught in the crossfire of his parents' mistakes. Could I really turn away from a child? The thought gnawed at me, tearing down the walls I'd built around myself over the years. Still, I couldn't ignore the bitterness simmering beneath the surface. "You threw me out without a second thought," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You believed Karen's lies about me, treated me like garbage, and now you're calling me for help." There was silence on the other end, heavy and suffocating. Then, barely audible, Tom replied, I know we messed up. And I'll never forgive myself for what we did to you. But right now, it's not about us, it's about our son. If we don't get him help soon, he might." His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Hearing the desperation in his tone made my stomach churn. This wasn't just about Tom or Karen anymore, it was about a child fighting for his life. A child who deserved better than the mess his parents had created. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The decision weighed heavily on me, pulling me into opposite directions. On one side was justice, the satisfaction of watching them reap what they had sown. On the other was compassion, the chance to rise above the pain and do the right thing. Finally, I spoke, my voice firm yet tinged with reluctance. "I'll send you the address of a clinic nearby. They offer free services for emergencies like this. Go there immediately." Before Tom could respond, I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. Whether it was the right choice or not, I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't stand idly by while a child suffered, not even for revenge. The phone call with Tom had already been excruciating, but when he started pleading not just for help, but for forgiveness, it felt like a knife twisting deeper into an old wound. "Look," Tom said, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation, "we were wrong, okay? Karen was wrong, and I was wrong for letting her push you out. We made mistakes, huge ones, but we're family, man. You can't turn your back on us now." His words hung heavy in the air, each syllable dripping with guilt-tripping sincerity. He even went so far as to suggest signing legal documents, a written promise that they would never repeat their past behavior. "We'll put it in writing," he insisted, as if a piece of paper could erase years of betrayal and pain. "You have my word, bro. It won't happen again. Just, please, let us stay with you, for the kid's sake." For a moment, I hesitated. The thought of those innocent children, my niece and nephew, being dragged through this mess tugged at something deep inside me. But then I remembered, this wasn't about them. This was about Tom and Karen trying to manipulate me yet again, using every tool at their disposal to get what they wanted. They'd done it before, twisting situations, lying, making me feel like the villain, and here they were, doing it all over again. "No," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I can't let you and Karen come into my life again. Not after everything that's happened." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "You're serious?" Tom asked, his tone shifting from desperate to incredulous. "After everything, you're really going to leave us out in the cold?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation, "because last time you left me out in the cold, Tom. Remember that? When Karen accused me of things I didn't do, when she convinced you I was some kind of monster, and when you both kicked me out without a second thought. Did you care about me then? No. So why should I care now?" Tom's breathing grew heavier, frustration seeping into his voice. "That was different. Things were complicated back then. Karen was pregnant, stressed, complicated." I shot back, my anger bubbling over. "It wasn't complicated for you to believe her lies about me flirting with her or hanging out with criminals. It wasn't complicated for you to throw me out based on nothing but rumors. And now, suddenly, it's complicated for me to say no. Spare me the excuses, Tom. I've heard enough." Before he could respond, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. A text message from Mom flashed across the screen. "If you don't help them, I will cut you off completely. No more son. Do you understand? My stomach dropped. Of all the low blows, this one hit hardest. My own mother, the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally, was threatening to disown me because I refused to bail out the very people who had abandoned me. Her words echoed in my mind, amplifying the pressure mounting around me. Was this how it was going to end? With everyone turning against me because I chose to protect myself. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly. Part of me wanted to cave, to give in to the guilt, to prove that I was still the good guy, the reliable one, the son who always came through no matter what. But another part of me, the stronger, wiser part, knew better. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for people who didn't value me. I had spent too long rebuilding my life, setting boundaries, and learning to stand up for myself. If I let them back in now, it would undo everything I had worked so hard to achieve. "I'm sorry, Tom," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I can't do it. I won't. You're making a huge mistake," Tom snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't just about you. It's about family. About sticking together when times are tough." "Family?" I laughed bitterly. Where was that loyalty when I needed it most? Where was the sticking together when you threw me out without a second thought? "You didn't care about family then, Tom. Don't pretend now that it matters." He didn't respond immediately, and in that silence, I could hear the truth sinking in. Finally, he sighed a defeated, weary sound. "Fine, if that's how you feel." "It is," I interrupted, leaving no room for negotiation. "And tell Mom that if she wants to cut me off, that's her choice. But I'm not going to let anyone guilt me into giving up my peace of mind, not anymore." When the call ended, I sat there for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the wall. The weight of my decision pressed down on me, but beneath it, there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I had stood up for myself, not just to Tom, but to everyone who tried to make me feel small. Yes, it hurt. Yes, it meant losing parts of my family. But it also meant reclaiming my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to live free from manipulation. The tension between me and my family reached its boiling point when my parents decided to call an emergency family meeting. The invitation itself was ominous, delivered through a curt text from my mom. "We need to talk about what's happening. Be here at 7 p.m. sharp." I knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. My stomach churned as I walked into their house that evening, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Everyone was already seated around the dining table: my parents, Tom, Karen, even some distant relatives who had no business being there. It felt less like a discussion and more like a tribunal. As soon as I sat down, my dad cleared his throat, his voice booming across the room. "Your mother and I have called this meeting because we're deeply disappointed in your behavior," he began, his tone dripping with disapproval. "Tom and Karen are struggling. They've lost everything: their home, their savings, and all they asked for was a little help. Yet you refused them. How could you turn your back on your own family?" The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could respond, my mom chimed in, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've always been so independent, but this time you've gone too far. You're acting selfishly, without thinking of anyone else. Do you realize how much pain you're causing?" I clenched my fists under the table, trying to keep my composure. "Selfishly, Mom, Dad, do you even remember what happened between us? Tom and Karen kicked me out of their house based on lies, lies that nearly destroyed me. And now you expect me to just forget everything and let them waltz back into my life." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact, while Tom stared at the floor, looking guilty but saying nothing. My dad slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough of this nonsense. Family sticks together, no matter what. What's done is done. You need to move past it and do the right thing." "The right thing?" I shot back, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You mean letting them walk all over me again? Letting Karen manipulate everyone like she did before? Is that what you call doing the right thing?" My mom gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "How dare you speak to your father that way, after everything we've done for you?" Her words hung heavy in the air, loaded with guilt trips designed to make me feel small, but I was done playing their game. "You want to know what you've done for me?" I snapped, standing up abruptly. "You stood by silently while Tom and Karen threw me out like garbage. You didn't lift a finger to help me when I was couch surfing, struggling to survive. And now you're criticizing me for protecting myself. For setting boundaries. Well, guess what? I'm not that person anymore." The room erupted into chaos. Voices rose, accusations flew, and chairs scraped against the floor as people gestured wildly. One of my aunts shouted something about family loyalty, while another relative muttered under her breath about how I was too proud. Through it all, Tom remained silent, his face pale, while Karen looked smug, as if she'd won some invisible victory. Unable to take any more, I grabbed my jacket and stormed out of the house. The cool night air hit me like a slap, grounding me momentarily. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed incessantly with texts from various family members demanding explanations or hurling insults. But one message stood out, a text from my best friend, Jake. "Hey man, sorry to hear about tonight. Just wanted to let you know. Your parents aren't exactly neutral in this. I heard they've been sending money to Tom and Karen behind your back. Thought you should know." My blood ran cold. So that was it. My parents weren't just passively siding with Tom, they were actively supporting him and Karen financially. All their talk about family was just a smokescreen to hide their true allegiance. The realization made me sick to my stomach. They hadn't called the meeting to resolve anything. They had called it to shame me into submission. The aftermath of my refusal to help Tom and Karen was anything but quiet. Just when I thought the storm had passed, a letter arrived from their lawyer, a formal, cold document filled with accusations that felt like daggers slicing through paper. The letter claimed I had abandoned my family in their time of greatest need and threatened legal action if I didn't reconsider my decision. My hands trembled slightly as I read it, not out of fear, but out of disbelief at how far they were willing to go to twist the truth. Did they really think dragging this into court would solve anything? Or was it just another desperate attempt by Karen to manipulate the situation? I set the letter down on my kitchen counter, staring at it for what felt like hours. A part of me wanted to laugh, it was so absurd, so theatrical, but another part of me couldn't ignore the weight of what they were trying to do. They weren't just attacking me, they were attempting to paint me as the villain, someone who turned their back on blood when it mattered most. But deep down, I knew the truth. I hadn't abandoned anyone. If anything, they were the ones who abandoned me, throwing me out based on lies and manipulation while pretending to be the victims now. Still, the threat lingered in the air like a dark cloud. For days, I wondered if they'd actually follow through with the lawsuit. Would they drag our dirty laundry into a courtroom, airing grievances that stemmed from their own mistakes? It was exhausting to even think about, but as the days turned into weeks, nothing happened. No summons, no further communication, just silence. I realized then that the letter wasn't about taking me to court. It was about intimidation, one last-ditch effort to make me cave under pressure, and I refused to let them win. Meanwhile, life for Tom and Karen spiraled further downhill. With nowhere else to turn, they ended up moving into a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of town, a place so run down it looked like it might collapse at any moment. The walls were cracked, the plumbing barely worked, and the neighborhood reeked of poverty and despair. This was a far cry from the comfortable home they once lived in, and every day must have felt like a slap in the face for Karen, whose pride had always been her armor against the world. But things only got worse. One evening, as I scrolled absent-mindedly through social media, I stumbled upon a post from a mutual acquaintance, a photo of Tom's son sitting alone on a park bench, his head bowed low. The caption read, "Poor kid gets bullied at school because his parents can't afford proper clothes or lunches anymore." My stomach churned as I stared at the image. The boy looked so small, so defeated, weighed down by circumstances entirely beyond his control. He wasn't responsible for his parents' poor decisions, yet he was paying the price. That night, I received a call from Tom, not angry or confrontational this time, but broken. His voice cracked as he spoke, each word heavy with regret. "It's happening all over again," he muttered, almost to himself, "just like when we kicked you out. People are treating us the way we treated you, like we're nothing. For a moment, I said nothing, letting the irony sink in. Karma, it seemed, had come full circle. But hearing the pain in his voice stirred something inside me, not pity, exactly, but an acknowledgement of how cruel life could be. Tom, I said finally, my tone firm but not unkind, you made your choices. Now you have to live with them. Maybe this is what it takes for you to understand what it feels like to lose everything. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. You're right, I deserve this. We both do. But the kids, they don't. His words stayed with me long after we hung up. As much as I resented Tom and Karen, I couldn't deny the injustice of their children suffering for their parents' failures. Yet, I also knew that shielding them from the consequences wouldn't fix anything. Sometimes, people need to hit rock bottom before they can truly change. In the months that followed, rumors spread about Tom working odd jobs to make ends meet, while Karen reportedly spent most of her days cooped up in their cramped apartment, bitter and resentful. Their lives had become a shadow of what they once were, a grim reminder of how quickly fortunes could shift. And though part of me wished things had turned out differently, I held onto the belief that standing my ground had been the right thing to do for me, for my sanity, and for the future I was determined to build without their toxicity.